To help us frame Canada's future in space, how we got here, and where we may be headed, everybody please welcome Alex MacDonald.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It is very good to see you all. So, merci. C'est un vraiment plaisir et un honneur d'être à nouveau ici, au milieu de cette magnifique collection d'aéronefs canadiennes. A lot has happened since we convened here last year. As a quick recap, since last year, the Government of Canada has initiated the Launch North program, allocating hundreds of millions of dollars towards 3 Canadian launch companies and a spaceport company. The government has also introduced a new bill in Parliament, Bill C-28, to modify legislation to clarify the regulatory responsibilities and liabilities for launch and re-entry in Canada, paving the way for our first sovereign orbital space flights to come. Oh, and of course, Canada has become the second country in the history of the world to have one of its citizens travel around the moon and return to Earth. Woo indeed. So, I think it's fair to say that lately Canada is showing some real leadership on the world stage in spaceflight in new and truly historic ways. Vraiment, je pense que nous sommes au cœur d'une renaissance spatiale canadienne. And you all here today are at the heart of it. One of the elements that I enjoyed the most from my career at NASA was being part of those moments and those teams of incredible, dedicated, passionate, and brilliant people, where everyone is working together to make possible technical achievements that, frankly, many others think are actually impossible. For me, this was the early commercialization of small satellites at the NASA Ames Research Center, the development of NASA's Commercial Crew Program in low Earth orbit, and the creation of the Artemis program. Today, I would argue that Canada and the Canadian space launch community is having one of those moments, and this room is indeed filled with the type of people who are working hard to make the seemingly impossible possible. When embarking upon something new, I often think it is valuable to examine the long-run history of the antecedents of that supposedly new phenomenon. This was an approach that I took when thinking about how to leverage and accelerate privately funded space exploration work, which formed a core through line of much of my career at NASA. It turned out there was actually a long history of this, dating back to the early billionaire-funded US observatories in the 19th century and the Guggenheim family's patronage of Robert Goddard's rocketry work in the 1920s and 30s. I would like to do something similar here today and discuss some of the long-run historical antecedents of Canadian space launch in the hopes that this history might tell us something interesting and useful about the endeavor we are embarking upon here, as well as about its importance for our country and our future. Because even though the momentum that we're all riding is relatively new, Canada actually has a fascinating and unexpectedly layered history of spaceflight rocketry dating back well over 100 years. I want to tell you 4 stories today from the history of spaceflight rocketry development in Canada, which I personally find inspiring and instructive, many of which I think are relatively unknown and which I think we should want more Canadians to be familiar with as part of the development of a national culture of spaceflight that supports sovereign Canadian space launch systems. These stories are the story of the first spaceflight narrative told about Canada in the 1650s. The story of the Scottish-Canadian scientist who was the first ever to accurately describe rockets as the best way to explore the solar system in a work of nonfiction in the 19th century. The story of the family of Canadian rockets that flew above the atmosphere first in Churchill, Manitoba, and which has flown to space around 1,000 times since. And the story of a rocketry collaboration with the United States that resulted in flights into space from above the Arctic Circle in the Northwest Territories and what is now Nunavut. Mais nous commençons naturellement pour une histoire du Canada au Québec. Dans les années 1650, il existait en France un intellectuel à la retraite et soldat savonien de Cyrano de Bergerac. Élève du célèbre astronome Pierre Gassendi, il était un fervent partisan du système copernicien. Il était convaincu que les planètes étaient habitées, qu'il existait des planètes autour des étoiles et que l'univers était infini. Il a aussi écrit le premier livre mettant en scène un homme voyageant dans l'espace à l'aide d'une fusée. Et, fait particulièrement pertinent pour nous ici au Canada aujourd'hui, il a situé cette histoire en Nouvelle-France, dans la ville de Québec. Dans son ouvrage Histoire comique des États et un père de la Lune, publié en 1657, Cyrano décrit différentes méthodes pour s'envoler vers la Lune. Son premier vol le conduit de France en Nouvelle-France en traversant l'océan Atlantique. C'est là, sur la place centrale de Québec, que le voyage spatial en fusée fait sa première apparition dans la littérature. Après avoir discuté de l'hypothèse de la pluralité du monde et de la nature infinie de l'univers avec le vice-roi de la Nouvelle-France, Jean de Lauzon, Cyrano a écrit que des fêtards avaient fixé des feux d'artifice, destinés naturellement à la célébration de la Saint-Jean-Baptiste, à son véhicule. Il tente d'arrêter les feux d'artifice, mais ceux-ci explosent et il se retrouve en route vers la Lune. Ce sont donc des Canadiens en fait, plutôt que Cyrano lui-même, qui construisent les premiers systèmes de fusées spatiales de l'histoire de la littérature. Je pense que nous devrions être fiers de cette histoire. Fiers que les origines de l'idée de la propulsion spatiale par fusée et les origines du Québec et du Canada soient ainsi intimement liées. L'histoire de l'avenir du Canada et celle de l'avenir de l'exploration spatiale seront également interlacées. Just as the origins of the history of the conceptual development of rocketry is interestingly interwoven with the origins of Quebec and Canada, it is also interwoven with the early history of Ontario and of Canadian universities. In 1862, the fifth principal of Queen's University, William Leach, described the basic principles of rocket-propelled spaceflight in a nonfiction book decades before anyone else in the world. William Leach was born near Glasgow in 1814, and he would become an astronomy popularizer, arguing like Cyrano in favor of the plurality of worlds, before emigrating to the United Province of Canada in 1860 to become the principal of Queen's College, today's Queen's University. It was while serving as principal that he also published an essay entitled A Journey Through Space, that articulated with remarkably forthright simplicity, for the first time in a nonfiction context, the idea that rockets could serve as the motive power behind the exploration of the solar system. To quote, "The only machine independent of the atmosphere we can conceive of would be one on the principle of the rocket. The rocket rises in the air, not from the resistance offered by the atmosphere to its fiery stream, but from the internal reaction. The velocity would, indeed, be greater in a vacuum than in the atmosphere. And could we dispense with the comfort of breathing air, we might, with such a machine, transcend the boundaries of our globe and visit other orbs." This remarkable statement appeared first in the Scottish magazine Good Words in September of 1861, and would be reprinted in Leach's God's Glory in the Heavens in 1862, which presented a tour of the solar system on a comet, but with the potential for rocketry to allow humans to voyage to other planets identified clearly at the start. It would be another 3 decades until the next published nonfiction text to clearly identify rockets as a means for space exploration would come from none other than Konstantin Tsiolkovsky's exploration of cosmic space by means of reaction devices in 1903. It was therefore a scholar working at a university in Canada that published history's first unambiguous recognition that rocketry would enable the exploration of space. Between Cyrano de Bergerac and William Leach, It turns out that Canada arguably has as long of an association with the history of spaceflight as any country on the planet. In this regards, our recent progress and national commitments to sovereign orbital launch should perhaps be seen not so much as something wholly new, but perhaps instead as the fulfillment of a national promise and potentiality that dates back before even Confederation. Now, that's great, you might say, that there were these interesting early Canadian literary histories to rocketry spaceflight, but we're interested in here in actual spaceflight rocketry, and well, what's Canada's real history there? Well, sometimes I think that we forget in our narratives of spaceflight that Canada has already actually developed one of the most successful space rockets ever built, one that is still flying today, and which, in its own way, is a long-term legacy rocket that, from a suborbital perspective, rivals the famed Russian Soyuz orbital rocket in its enduring multi-decade operations and simply in its incredible number of flights. I'm referring, of course, to the Black Brant rocket. On September 5th, 1959, Canada became the 7th country in the world to reach above the atmosphere and into space with the successful launch of the Canadian-built Black Brant 1, which reached an apogee of around 100 kilometers, otherwise known as the von Karman line, the internationally defined demarcation of space, in a flight that took place from the Churchill Research Range in northern Manitoba. Since then, the Black Brant family of rockets, which has included 12 different core design variants and dozens of different sub-configurations, has become the scientific suborbital rocket of choice around the world, launching above 100 kilometers into space from at least 7 different countries, including the US, Norway, Sweden, Australia, Brazil, Spain, and, of course, Canada. It's actually difficult, it turns out, to get an exact count of the number of launches into space that the Black Brant has done because there are actually so many of them. But most counts put it at around 1,000 launches, making it either the second or third most space-flown rocket family of all time, after the Russian Soyuz family and probably the US Nike family of suborbital rockets. The rocket and its core enabling technology of a high-performance solid fuel rocket motor was originally designed at the Canadian Armament Research and Development Establishment in Valcartier, Quebec, today's DRDC Valcartier. The government defense establishment then contracted with Bristol Aerospace in Winnipeg to begin production of the rocket and to support the launches at the Churchill Research Range. Bristol Aerospace is today Magellan Aerospace, and Magellan continues to produce the Black Brant, in particular for NASA, which still uses it to conduct research missions on the Northern Lights and Aurora above the Earth, as well as for astrophysics, heliophysics, and microgravity research missions. Magellan even recently won a new 5-year, $75 million US contract to continue to support NASA's suborbital rocket program in 2024. Now, of course, a suborbital rocket is a ways away from an orbital rocket, but one of the reasons that we should have confidence that Canada can build a sovereign orbital launch capability is because Canada has, in fact, already reliably and consistently produced, in large numbers, rockets that travel into space. And I think that some of the elements of how that happened point the way to future success. A defense customer taking the lead. Commercial production by a company working hand in hand with that defense customer. And that company eventually targeting and realizing large-scale production for global export. As we tell the story of what is happening in Canadian orbital launch today, I think it's important for us to remember and remind people in Canada of this fact that we have actually already achieved many rocket flights into space. What we now need to do is revamp the approach that has worked in the past and execute with new orbitally scalable technologies that can give us just that little bit more delta V. Okay, so the last Canadian rocketry story that I want to tell today is one that frankly I wasn't even aware of last year. Last year, when I was here, I had thought that the only place where rockets had launched to space from within Canada was the Churchill Research Range in Manitoba, which launched thousands of rockets, many above the von Karman line. And I thought that the efforts to build spaceports in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and potentially even British Columbia were going to be the next locations on the list. I was unaware, however, that, in fact, there are two other places in Canada from which rockets have launched above the von Karman line. And those two places are, in fact, firmly in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle. Those two places are Cape Perry in the Northwest Territories and Sinirajak in Nunavut. On Cape Perry, there were 18 launches from 1969 to 1981, mostly Canadian Black Brant rockets and American Nike Tomahawks, with the Black Brants reaching the farthest into space at 660 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. Sinirajak saw 7 launches, all Nike Tomahawk vehicles flown to around 270 kilometers in 1971. How did these space flights in the Canadian Arctic come about? Well, for one, both Cape Perry and Sinirajak were key parts of one of the great joint projects of US-Canadian cooperation for continental defense during the Cold War. The Distant Early Warning Line, or the DEW Line, which was a system of over 60 radar stations across Alaska, Canada, and Greenland that was the predecessor to today's North Warning System, designed to give notice about any incoming missile threats to the continent, and which served during its time as a core driver of logistics and economic development in the Canadian Arctic. The photo here is of the joint radar facilities as they still stand at Sinirajak today. But there was another element too. Other than the National Research Council of Canada, the major entity that utilized Cape Perry and Sinirajak was NASA. It was NASA that operated the Nike Tomahawks as part of plasma investigation missions investigating the behavior of the Northern Lights. So even before Canadian astronauts flew on NASA space shuttles then, Canada and NASA collaborated to launch rockets into space from the Canadian Arctic. When I learned this, I had to reach out to the NASA History Office to see if they had any photos of these launch campaigns, which I think would be incredible to see. But sadly, they didn't have any photos of those campaigns or the NASA teams in Sinirajak or Cape Perry. But NASA did have some of the photos of a damaged NASA Nike Cajun rocket at Fort Churchill in 1968, which they kindly cleared for public release. To my knowledge, this is the first time that these images of a NASA rocket in Manitoba in the 1960s have ever been shown in public. These are admittedly hardly the most exciting rocket photos you're ever going to see. But they are at least a reminder that there is a great degree of fascinating Canadian spaceflight history that we should be doing a lot more to uncover and bring to light as we seek to develop a culture encouraging of sovereign Canadian space capabilities. I'd like to conclude then by just emphasizing what we might learn from these different stories of history as we embark on the critical work of the future of sovereign launch before us. I think that these stories should remind us that connections between Arctic development, continental defense, and spaceflight are enduring, and that this could form potentially the basis of a new multi-pronged strategy that would lead to new partnerships, new sovereign capabilities, and new investments. I think these stories should also remind us that Canada definitely can develop highly successful, high-throughput rocket production capabilities because we already have. They should remind us also that bold spaceflight ambitions and visions are in fact so Canadian that they could be found even at the origins of Canada before Confederation. They should even remind us that Jeremy Hansen and Cyrano de Bergerac are tied together by a unique, distinctly Canadian thread of spaceflight inspiration and lunar achievement. These are part of the legacy that we all inherit as Canadians. What we get to do now is to build something new, a new Canadian legacy of sovereign orbital capabilities that will help form the foundation of economic strength and national security for the generations of Canadians that come after us. It will not be easy. There are real technical challenges ahead, as well as likely some difficult programmatic decisions to be made as well. Nonetheless, developing a Canadian orbital sovereign launch capability has now been declared of national importance by the Government of Canada, and frankly, we all in this room now need to just get this done. Canada is watching, and the world is actually watching. We still have a long way to go, but we've made impressive progress in only 1 year, and I can hardly wait to see Canadian launch vehicles rise into the sky on their way to putting Canadian and international payloads into orbit around the Earth. L'histoire des vols spatiaux canadiens nous montre que c'est possible. Au Canada, nous sommes à l'origine des coureurs de bois, oui, mais aujourd'hui nous sommes de plus en plus des coureurs de fer et des coureurs de code. Et nous serons bientôt et pour toujours des coureurs de ciel. So, I just want to thank you all for everything that you are doing to make this future possible. With that, allons-y.